Hello. I'd like to share with you a truly inspirational story of lost faith and redemption. I know a man who once led a life of crime. I'll call him Andrew, though that's not his real name, but this is his real story, for he prefers to remain anonymous. Though raised in a Christian faith, Andrew had long since lost his moral bearings and had fallen into a sordid criminal career that included burglary, pimping, racketeering, and even sexual assault. For 20 years he was stuck in the revolving door, in and out of jails and prisons, until one day a judge said enough and sentenced him to life behind bars. Andrew despaired of ever gaining his freedom again and was determined to use the most drastic means to avoid living out the rest of his days in prison. In the LA County Jail, he'd managed to obtain and hide a razor blade and was only waiting for the determination of which prison hellhole he was to be sent to before ending his misery for good. And this would be no childish play for attention. He knew where to cut. Not the wrists like an amateur, where you bled too slowly to accomplish the deed before some do-gooder found you, but the veins of the inner arm at the elbow, where you could bleed out quickly and be dead before anyone could tend to you. All seemed lost for Andrew, but God had not abandoned him. And as we'll see, evidence of his love sometimes comes via strange messengers. For Andrew, the messenger was a cop who'd been part of the team that arrested him his last night of freedom, when the police watched him do 4 burglaries in Beverly Hills before surrounding him at a convenience store on Wilshire Boulevard. This cop had heard of Andrew because of an incident now part of police lore at his previous post. A wild foot chase by cops and firemen through the downtown streets of Hermosa Beach, following Andrew's escape from the police station while he was being booked. Andrew was a very bold and resourceful person, and this inventiveness became sharpest when he was desperate. But this cop had sensed something different about the brash, defiant criminal he'd arrested that night and the model citizen he'd surreptitiously observed over the last month. For 4 weeks he'd been part of a coalition team that watched a normal guy hold down a job as manager and trainer at a health club, seen him socialize with some of LA's famous athletes, and they thought this must be the wrong guy. Then, on the last night of the stakeout, they observed Andrew come out of his house dressed all in black, a ski mask in his hand, and they knew this was the right guy, and followed him as he went on a burglary spree in the mansions of Beverly Hills, then busted him at a 7-Eleven with over $200,000 worth of stolen jewelry. A few days after his arrest, this cop came to see Andrew in jail. He told him that when he was handcuffing and loading him into the cruiser, a voice in his head said, "This man would be all right if he only knew God." "Jesus wanted me to bring you this Bible," he said. Andrew didn't burst out laughing, as was his first inclination, but accepted the gift. It's not wise for a prisoner to offend in any way an officer of the law. But he had no time for fairy tales. Religion was a joke in a world of hypocrisy and deceit, where the police beat you up in the back of a cruiser and then lied about it in court. "Oh, Your Honor, he fell down." So once back in his cell, Andrew disdainfully pitched the cop's gift through the bars onto the floor for anyone to take. The next morning, when they were marched back to their cells from breakfast, the Bible was resting on his bunk. "Someone's messing with me," he thought, and this time he angrily threw it out over the walkway rail to the cell level below. No one would know where it came from now, and he forgot about it. A week later, the Bible was back on his bunk. Now, things like this just didn't happen in jail. It was a very expensive Bible, of family heirloom quality, and he knew such things were coveted by men in lockup. This got his attention and made him curious as to why this was happening to him. Curious enough to open up the Bible he'd never read, not even in the parochial schools of his youth, where reading the Bible was actually discouraged. It was deemed too difficult to be comprehended without the interpretation of a priest. But now Andrew started to read, and he read and read, devouring and savoring the words as a starving man might his first meal upon returning home after days of wandering lost in the woods. For lost he was, his soul, unbeknownst to Andrew all these years, had been hungering for spiritual sustenance. All the stealing, the stealthy, secretive existence in the shadows of life had been but an acting out of anger for the loss he felt in his heart. And what now touched him most was the New Testament's simple message of redemption and salvation. Jesus taught that God's forgiveness was available to all, regardless of one's station in life, from the ragged leper to the rich Sadducee. Jesus had even forgiven criminals from the cross. Easter Sunday in prison for most inmates is just like any other day, and it's easy to forget its true meaning. But the next Easter morn, our Andrew lay in his bunk trying to relate the tragedy of his life to the events of Jesus' passion still fresh in his memory. From his reading of biblical commentary, he'd learned of another meaning to Easter that focused not on Jesus' suffering for mankind's sins, important though that was, but in his resurrection from death to a new life. And though his jaded worldliness still wanted to dismiss the tale as myth, he could not deny the feeling that there was a broader symbolic message of salvation and renewal that applied to all of life's travails. Could Jesus' death and rebirth be a lesson each of us could use in our everyday lives? Perhaps we didn't have to wait for death to experience a resurrection. Perhaps another sort of resurrection, the opportunity to transform our lives, was available to us at every instant through God's grace. Every trouble, every trial, every limitation in life was a crucifixion of sorts. Weren't human beings figuratively lashed to these events as Christ was to the cross, feeling helpless and persecuted? Wasn't God, through his Son, telling Andrew that even his life was worth saving? That hidden in Andrew, the real core of Andrew, stripped of the hardened facade of a career criminal, there still was that little boy who was awed and moved by the powerful church icons of his youth, especially the sanctuary crucifix with its graphically tortured body of Jesus. Andrew closed his eyes to ponder these questions, and Jesus' words drifted into memory. Receive the kingdom of God like a child. In his mind's eye, he became the young Andy again, kneeling before the altar with Christ writhing on the cross above, an innocent child struggling to understand how this suffering pertained to him. Then he witnessed a vision unfold in his mind. The cross began to fade away, and Jesus' agonized face softened. Then behind Jesus he saw another figure, different yet the same. A figure clad in robes of glory, a figure that was also Jesus, the transformed Jesus, the risen Christ. The wooden cross had disappeared, and in its place was a numinous form, the risen one, that now seemed to be supporting Jesus' limp physical body. The cross had been but the bridge to transcendence. The truth and power of Jesus was in his everlasting spirit. It was a powerful image, a true vision of transformation, and in that instant Andrew's life too was transformed, and he prayed for forgiveness and that he be allowed to make amends for his past transgressions. When Andrew opened his eyes, he knew what the vision meant for him personally. He must seek beyond his personal crucifixion for his personal resurrection with the faith that Jesus taught through his supreme example. Any human problem is robbed of its controlling power by our faith in its solution. Andrew understood with a fresh clarity that the real cross he bore was not the prison that contained him, but the hate and fear in his heart. It was time to transform himself, to change his heart, to think only of God, of love, of faith, and of hope. If he prayed for these things instead of wasting his hours on thoughts of persecution and revenge, he would receive their blessings, for he too was a child of God. And what of these prison walls? Space and time were no barriers to God. Believe in freedom, and freedom is yours. From that moment, Andrew's attitude towards life did change, and he threw away that razor blade.